Hello and welcome. In this session, you're going to learn about FIDO2 security keys, how to set FIDO2 security keys up in Azure AD, and to do that, we're going to use a temporary access pass. So you'll learn about temporary access passes as well. You'll also learn how FIDO2 keys are phishing resistant. And I'm going to show you how to enable phishing resistant MFA in Azure AD. Lots of demos along the way. Subscribe and learn and join me in the cloud. Before we get into the details of FIDO2 keys, let's remind ourselves about why passwords are so vulnerable. We have a user that needs to access a relying party. And that relying party could be a single website. It could be an identity service provider such as Azure AD. And by authenticating against Azure AD, you have access to maybe hundreds of different websites and services. So what's our first problem? Our first problem is that our user is actually going to create a password which is going to be shared with the relying party. How well does the relying party actually store that password? If it's Azure AD, very securely. If it's a website, well, good question. The next problem is users create predictable passwords. And those predictable passwords are very susceptible to spray attacks. A spray attack is where we spray the same password across thousands of accounts. And there's a very good chance that you will break into a number of them. So you're picking low-hanging fruit. Brute force attacks are possible, but they'll probably be blocked by some relying parties. This is where we play different passwords against the same account. The big challenge though, and of course it doesn't apply to a service like Azure AD, but it applies to websites, is that they get hacked, right? And when they get hacked, that store of usernames and passwords can end up on the dark web. So your credentials have been leaked. Right? And if you look at the haveibeenpwned.com website, you'll see that, I looked a few days ago, 656 pwned websites with an absolutely huge number of pwned accounts. And those accounts, well, it depends how the password was stored as to how easy they are to actually derive the password from them. But it results in credential stuffing. And the big problem is users use the same passwords on multiple sites. So passwords, absolute nightmare, get rid of them. And how do we do that? We eliminate shared secrets. So we need a new way of working. And we can replace shared secrets with asymmetric cryptography. So now we have a user that wants to access the relying party. The user has access to a secure store, and in that secure store is stored each relying party the user needs to go to. Right? And to actually allow the user to gain access to that relying party, there'll need to be a thing called a registration ceremony. Because what we do is the user, for a particular relying party, generates a private and public key, and then the public key is registered with the relying party. So now all the relying party has is a store of user IDs and public keys. If that gets stolen, it's useless. You can't do anything with it. So number one, that makes things a lot safer. Now, when the user wants to access the relying party, what they do is they create a signed message. And the message is signed with the private key, which never ever leaves the user's possession. Now, what can we tell when we receive that message? So I'm a relying party. I've received this message. I can tell two things and only two things. It proves the message has not been tampered if we validate the signature, right? And secondly, it proves that the sender is the owner of the private key. So as long as we keep those private keys securely, we're basically have a new way of authenticating against relying parties. Now, let's look in a little bit more detail at FIDO2. So we have our relying party, and our relying party has a database of user IDs and public keys, and our user initiates a sign-in. And what the relying party does is sends back a challenge, and it says, please give me the credentials to prove who you are. And that's the message that goes back. Now, the important thing about that message going back, it says, please give me the credentials that will prove who you are to example.com. So it's actually identifying the relying party. And I'll come back to that when I talk about phishing. That challenge is passed through to an authenticator. And then the user unlocks the authenticator. Once the user has unlocked the authenticator has access to the secure store. And what the authenticator does is it takes the challenge and generates a response. And that response is signed with the private key for the relying party. So in this case, example.com. So we've now signed it, and that is sent back. And that response is actually known as an assertion. So the receiving relying party now validates the response using the public key that it has that is associated for that particular user. And that's the FIDO2 actual experience, or what goes on. Of course, there's a lot more detail that I could go into, but we don't have time right now. So there are two ceremonies. There's a registration ceremony, and during the registration ceremony, the key generates the public-private key pair, and the public part of the key is passed to the relying party. That's the registration ceremony. And then what we have is an authentication ceremony, which is really what we've just seen in action. So FIDO2 components and protocols. Well, WebAuthn is how the relying party talks to the client platform. And on the client platform, there's some client-side JavaScript, and all the modern browsers have built into them the WebAuthn APIs. And those APIs allow the browser to communicate with the authenticator. And it can authenticate using near-field communication, Bluetooth, or USB. And it uses CTAP, which is the client to authenticator protocol, and it's actually CTAP2. We don't have to use a roaming authenticator. We could use platform auth APIs to actually talk to a platform authenticator of some kind. And of course, typically that is a TPM. And Windows Hello is FIDO2 compliant. Now, on the server side, we need some other components. So we're going to have our libraries, which will allow us to access the user and public key store. Remember, we've got a user identifier and a public key stored for all of our users. And then we have this thing called attestation verification. Now, an attestation is a statement about the authenticator. And it's a statement that we can look at and we can say, okay, I'm happy with that authenticator. And it's an attestation that actually comes as attestation metadata that is for each model of authenticator. It's not done on individual authenticators. It's done for a model. So a range of authenticators from one particular manufacturer. And we can have an attestation trust store to see if we're going to trust those. But what about new keys that come along? Well, there is the external metadata service. So if we look at those attestations in a bit more detail, they are specific to a particular model from a particular vendor. And it provides characteristics and capabilities to the authenticator. You could actually have a little picture of the authenticator in the metadata. What the metadata allows us to do is actually evaluate risk based on authenticators that are being used. So I can actually say, I only want to use a particular authenticator. Now, how do we identify the authenticators? They use what's called an authenticator attestation GUID or an AA GUID. And during the registration, the authenticator also signs the response with an attestation private key that's burnt into the device. It's not on a per device basis. This is about attestation, so it's on a per model basis. And we can validate that all the way to the root. Now, you may have heard, and you will occasionally see in the interface, mention of passkey. And in early 2022, the FIDO Alliance proposed a multi-device support for FIDO2 credentials. So if you take a FIDO2 key, the credentials are just supported on that key. You cannot copy them, back them up, or anything else. What you can do is create two keys. So if you lose one, you've got the other. But this proposal is proposing that actually on a mobile phone, or maybe a tablet, we could actually store credentials that are transferable between users' devices. And in 2022, also it was in May, Microsoft, Apple, Google announced they're going to support passkey. And you will actually see the mention of passkey if you're using Chrome browser. Let's get started with the demos. We're going to experience this both from an administrative perspective in terms of configuring FIDO2, configuring TAP, and so on, and also from a user experience. I'm working today as the administrator in the Microsoft Entra Admin Center, and of course I'm going to go to Azure AD. From a user perspective, I'm working inside Chrome, and I'm going to go first off to my account. And I'm signing in as a user called V-John. I'm just using a password. So we're signing in, and I want to discover what authentication methods are available to John Brown. So we look in security information, and we see that there are no methods available. Okay, we want John Brown just to use FIDO2 keys. So we need to provision him with the capability of having FIDO2. So we'll close that off and we'll go into the portal, and what I'm looking for in here under Protect and Secure is authentication methods. And if I look at FIDO2 security keys, currently it's not enabled. I'm going to enable it, and I have a group that was actually already previously added. And our user, V-John, is inside this particular group. If we look at configuration, what we can see is allow self-service setup. Yes, users have to actually do the setup themselves because they will need to be involved in registering the key. If you enforce attestation, remember we looked at attestation. What an attestation was, it's declaring a characteristic of the key. And what we can do is we can validate that declaration and the key involved in that declaration all the way to the FIDO2 root in the trust chain. So we say yes, it has to be validated to the root of the trust chain. If we say no, we could use a self-signed FIDO2 keys, and there are some of those around, particularly developer keys. I've got another option here, enforce key restrictions. I'm going to say yes, and I'm going to say allow, and I'm going to allow only one particular type of key in my organization. And I actually have two keys available to me. I have a trust key, and I also have a FATAN key. Now, absolutely no reason for my choice, but I'm going to choose to add an AA GUID, which will identify the trust key solutions key. And I'm saying here, allow these keys, and it's going to block everything else. So I'm going to go save on that. And that's actually now saved the new method. And what we can do is we can go back into my account and see if that's available. So I'm going to go in again as John and see if we have any methods available to us. And I don't actually expect to see a method at the moment because of latency. So it's still showing no methods available. Well, let's go off and do another piece of work. I want to prepare my security key. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to the account sign-in options, and under here it says security key. So I'm going to go manage security key, and it says insert your security key. So I'm going to insert the security key, and I'm touching it just to prove I'm here. And it's saying, what would you like to do? Put a pin on it, do biometric on it. The thing is, at the moment, the key has already been initialized as in use. So I'm going to go reset, and it says you need to be very careful here because it's going to clear out all the secrets on that key. I'm going to say proceed. It's asking me to remove the key, which I will do now, and to put it back in again. That is because you need to reset the key within 10 seconds of inserting it. So it's saying touch the key twice. 1, 2. And the reset is complete. So now I have a completely blank key. Next job is I need to put a pin on it because if the biometric reader fails, I absolutely need a pin. So we'll allow that. And now I can set up a biometric. So again, to do that, I will need to resupply the pin. And I'm going to touch the key, and I just touch it multiple times until the key thinks it's got a reasonable reading of my fingerprint. So we'll keep doing it. Okay, that's done. And you can obviously do another finger as well if you wanted to. Okay, so now I have an initialized key. Let's go back and have a look and see if now the ability to add a FIDO2 key has been added under my account. So again, to my account, we're back in as John. We're signing in as John. And we look at security information and add a sign-in method. Still no methods available. Okay, back again after about a 5-minute delay. So I'm going to go add sign-in method now and choose a method. I'm going to go for a security key and I'm going to add it. And it says to set up a security key, you need to sign in with two-factor authentication. Well, I don't have it because I haven't set up the key yet. So I could put in another form of two-factor authentication that the user could register for. But here I want to use a temporary access pass. So we'll close that off. So cancel that, close that. I'm going to go down to temporary access pass. And if we look at it, it's enabled. It's enabled for the auth tap users group. And I'm going to go to configure. And in here, what I can do is configure a minimum lifetime and a maximum lifetime for all temporary access passes in my tenant. I then can declare a default lifetime, but the default lifetime is adjustable between the minimum and the maximum when you actually issue a temporary access pass to a user. Then you've got the length of the temporary access pass and whether you can choose a one-time or a multi-use. If I say require one time, it's a tenant-wide setting. If I say no to that, then it's up to the administrator who's issuing the temporary access pass to decide if it can be used for one time or multiple use. Obviously, one time is safer. A user uses it and cannot use it again. I'm going to leave these default settings just as they are. So I'm going to cancel that. And that is the under authentication method policies, temporary access pass is enabled for my tap users. So I'm going to go off and find John. So we're going to users. And what I'm looking for here is V-John. And there's V-John, who's John Brown. I'm going down to authentication methods. And down in authentication methods, I can go add an authentication method. I'm going to choose a method, which is going to be temporary access pass. Right? And I can delay the start time, so I could issue it now, but it's not valid for a certain period of time. I can change the activation duration, but only between the minimum and the maximum times that was set in the authentication methods policy. And then I could say it's usable one-time use. So I'm quite happy here to leave it. I want to actually use it multiple times because I want to show you some things. So I'm going to go add. This has added a temporary access pass for our particular user. And you've got the when it's valid from, when it's valid until, when it was created and so on. And the recommended link for people to go to actually update their security information. So I'm just going to make a note of that temporary access pass. So I've got it for use. I'm going to go OK on that. And now I'm going to contact John Brown and say, hey, look, I've got you a temporary access pass. So John Brown is now going to go and authenticate again against my account. And when he authenticates again, he's now asked to enter the temporary access pass. So we're going to do that. I'm going to drop that in. That was the one I can show it. So it's exactly the same pass. And I'm going to sign in. And no thanks to that. And then I'm going to go to security information. And now, hopefully, I can register my key because a temporary access pass has strong authentication. So we go add a method, and here we can choose security key. So we're going to add the security key. We're going to choose USB. We can also use near field communication. Next on there. And we're going to finish our setup. And this is where we initial the key. So an external security key or built-in sensor. Notice it's used the name passkey there. So I'm going to choose that option. And I'm going to actually insert the key, which I've done. And I'm going to touch the key. And it's going to do a biometric read of my fingerprint, I hope. Which it has done. And we need to give it a name. I'm going to call it FIDO-1 or FIDO2-1 as it's my first key. So I'm going to go next on there and we're done. I now have a FIDO2 security key set up. I should really remove my temporary access pass because I've used it. I don't want it to exist anymore. I could delete it. If it was a one-time use, then it's no longer valid, but I can still use it and I want to use it in a minute. Okay. I'm going to add another key. So I'm going to add a sign-in method. I'm going to add the security key and add that in. And again, it's USB. And I'm going to remove my current key. Next on there. Again, it's redirecting it to a new window to finish the setup. Going to say it's an external key. I'm going to go OK on that. And I'm going to insert my key. So I'm going to put my key in. OK. And touch the key, which I'm doing. Which hopefully it's going to be able to read my fingerprint. It hasn't done so, so it's asking for a PIN, which I can put in. Touch the security key to prove that I'm present. So, proved I'm present. It's now loading. Give it a name, or I don't know, we'll call it FIDO2-2. Whoops, FIDO2, get it right in a minute, FIDO2-2, next on there. And it says we detected that this particular key type has been blocked by your organization. Have a chat with your administrator. Okay, so that's because we put the AA GUID and said we can only use keys that were from TrustKey. So we'll cancel that. That was unsuccessful. We haven't actually registered the key. Right. Our next job is to go and experience its use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this off. refresh the portal, and we can see the FIDO2 key has been registered. We can actually look at the details of that as well, so we can see the AAD good. And this, of course, is the administrative experience. Okay, let's go and try our users again. Okay, so let's have a look at John's experience. And I'm going to sign in as John. You could use this temporary access pass because we didn't disable it. Other ways to sign in, and I'm going to use the security key. And what it's doing, it's asking me to touch the key, which I'm doing. And it's read the key, and we can see that we're in with FIDO and MFA. Okay, let's just have a look at an experience of one other user of ours, and that is Tina. So I'm going to again go into OIDC-v1, and I'm coming in here as Tina, and she is passwordless, so she's just going to supply the number, and she supplied the number, and we're in, and we can see it's RSA and MFA. Okay, so that's perfect. Before I go on with the demo of actually using the phishing-resistant side of a FIDO2 key, what I want to do is talk about what is phishing. Well, when we fish, we put a worm on the end of our rod. And the first thing that happens, of course, is we lure our fish in. And this message here looks remarkably genuine. And it says you've got undelivered emails. Well, no one likes not having their emails delivered. So they click on here to update their delivery preferences. And then they're asked to log in. Now, being a very diligent person, this person's checked the background. Yes, it looks like my corporate network login. Checks the URL. Well, it's got a padlock, so HTTPS, definitely. Microsoftonline.com. That looks absolutely genuine. Well, let's look a little bit harder. Log Microsoftonline.com. Is that really Microsoft? Or is it someone else? And when I was actually researching this, and it was a while back now, I could have bought logmicrosoftonline.com for 99 pence. I didn't buy it. And the reason I didn't buy it is I wouldn't dare use it because Microsoft would probably come down on me like a ton of bricks. But this is the lure, and the first implementation, we are trying to get the user to go to an invalid website to log on. Okay, so let's look a little bit more detail at the anatomy of an attack. So our user thinks they're signing into Azure AD. And, they've checked that they've got an HTTPS connection. But of course, what's happened is we've been lured to go to the hacker's site. So our HTTPS connection is to our person in the middle's website. And that is creating a connection through to Azure. So everything we send to the hacker can be sent through to Azure. Everything that comes back from Azure goes through the hacker. So the hacker will have, if we're signing in with just a password, the hacker's going to have session cookies and everything else they need to remain connected to Azure with the identity of the user. You say, hang on a minute, shouldn't we put in MFA? Yes, we can put in MFA. The problem is that MFA, we've got an SMS, we've got a push notification, and the user's going to respond to that. And even if we're using an SMS, we can actually gather the response from the user, right, in the hacker's screen and pass it back to Azure. So there's no real prevention against a person in the middle attack. Now, do you remember when I was talking about the FIDO2 key, I said the relying party requests a credential for example.com. And if we're using FIDO2 keys with Azure, what Azure is going to do is request a credential for Microsoftonline.com, right? Or Azure AD if you want to call it that. And what will happen on the client side, the client is going to see the point of origin of the request and that's where the HTTP request is coming from, is log microsoftonline.com. So the credential is being asked for to microsoftonline.com, and the origin is seen coming from log microsoftonline.com. So it's immediately rejected. So we have something now that is phishing resistant. What I'm going to do is go back into a demo showing you how we can actually set up authentication strength and use it within conditional access policy to make a user sign into Azure AD phishing resistant. Now, I want to go back to the portal and I want to go to authentication methods, which are down here, and I want to look at the authentication strength. Here you can define the strength of the multi-factor device that you actually want to use. We could say just for ordinary multi-factor, I'm happy that you use a Windows Hello for Business, FIDO2 security key, a certificate with a 1, 2, 3, 4 OID in it, because otherwise the certificate is single factor, Microsoft Authenticator, phone sign-in, and so on. If we go for passwordless, then there's only a few choices. So there's Windows Hello for Business, there's a FIDO2 security key, no passwords involved, certificates, and there's the Microsoft Authenticator phone sign-in that's available to us. Now, if we want to go phishing resistant, then the only 3 options available are Windows Hello for Business, FIDO2 security key, and a certificate with a 1, 2, 3, 4 OID in it. What I want to do now is I want to go to conditional access and I want to switch my application from just using standard MFA to changing the control to actually require authentication strengths. And we can choose in here and go down to phishing resistant MFA. Select that and save it. Now that might take a few seconds to ripple through. So what I'm going to do is go back and look at the authentication methods again and the authentication method strengths. And one thing you can do is you can define your own strength criteria. So you can name this so it can actually be used within conditional access, and you can choose what you actually want to do. So you could choose phishing resistant, or you could choose just Windows Hello for Business, and so on. It's your decisions. Okay, let's go back now and actually have a look from a user's perspective again. And I'm going to go in first off into my OIDC v1 app, and I'm going to do it as Tina. So we go to authenticate as Tina, and it's asking for 78. And she's being prompted for some way of verifying her identity. It's saying, hey, use a certificate or smart card. Well, she's not going to get in. But so let's cancel that off and let's have a look. Well, she's shown as being signed in. So I'm going to actually close the browser and go back in again. And I'm going to sign in here as my user v-john. Not with a temporary access pass, but with a FIDO2 security key. And we're going to touch the key again. And we're in. So there you are. That's a phishing resistant sign-in. Well, that's it. Get started with FIDO2 keys today. Subscribe and learn. I'll see you in the cloud. Thanks for watching my channel. Subscribe for more free training. You might like to join me for my Identity Masterclass. Hopefully, see you soon.